Picture this. Christmas week, 1987. A ferry packed with families heading home for the holidays suddenly becomes a floating inferno in the middle of the night. Over 4,000 people, more than 3 times the Titanic's death toll. And for 32 years, nobody knew exactly where they ended up, until now. You've probably never heard this story, and that's exactly the problem. While the whole world knows about the Titanic, this disaster, the MV Doña Paz, killed more people in a single night than any peacetime maritime accident in human history. We're talking about entire families wiped out while they slept, children who never made it home for Christmas, parents who never got to hug their kids goodbye. But here's what's really going to get under your skin. This wasn't some unavoidable tragedy caused by an iceberg or a storm. This was pure human negligence, the kind of negligence that makes you wonder how many other disasters are just waiting to happen, because somebody somewhere decided that safety regulations are just suggestions. And when they finally found the ship in 2019, sitting perfectly preserved on the ocean floor, the footage they captured will haunt you, because you can see everything. The decks where people ran for their lives, the railings they climbed over to escape the flames, the bridge where the crew should have been paying attention but weren't. This is the story of the MV Doña Paz, and I'm warning you right now, once you hear what really happened that night, you're never going to look at ferry travel the same way again. The MV Doña Paz wasn't supposed to be a death trap. It was just another crowded ferry doing what thousands of Filipino families depended on every single day, connecting the scattered islands of the Philippines so people could visit family, get to work, or in this case, make it home for Christmas. But let me paint you a picture of what was really happening on December 20th, 1987. This wasn't just another day at the office for the ferry operators. This was the Christmas rush in a country where family gatherings during the holidays aren't just tradition, they're sacred. Imagine millions of people trying to get home to their families, and ferries are basically the only way to island hop in the Philippines. The Doña Paz had started its life way back in 1963 in Japan, where it was built as the Himeyuri Maru. It was a solid, well-constructed ship designed for coastal passenger service. But by the time it ended up in Philippine waters in the 1970s, it had been through more transformations than a reality TV star. First, it was renamed the Don Sulpicio. Then, after a fire in 1979. Yeah, you heard that right. The ship had already survived one fire. It was rebuilt and renamed the Doña Paz. Now here's where things start to get really disturbing. The ship was officially rated to carry 608 passengers safely. That's what the paperwork said. That's what the safety inspectors were supposed to enforce. But the manifest for that final voyage listed 1,493 passengers and 59 crew members, already more than double the safe capacity. But even that number was a complete lie. Survivors later revealed the horrifying truth. There were over 4,000 people crammed onto that ferry. Over 4,000. We're talking about families with forged tickets, because the legitimate ones were sold out. Children who weren't even counted on the manifest because their parents figured they could just hold them on their laps. People sleeping in hallways, on decks, in stairwells, anywhere they could find a few square feet of space. And here's what's going to make your blood boil. Sulpicio Lines, the company that owned the ferry, knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't some accidental oversight. This was a calculated business decision. Christmas travel meant big money, and every extra passenger was pure profit. Safety regulations, those were just annoying government paperwork that cut into the bottom line. But it gets worse. The ferry industry in the Philippines during the 1980s was basically the Wild West of maritime transport. Companies were competing to see who could pack the most people onto their ships, and the government enforcement was so weak it might as well have been non-existent. Inspectors could be bought off, safety certificates could be faked, and passenger manifests were treated more like creative writing exercises than legal documents. The crew of the Doña Paz had loaded people everywhere. The dining areas were packed with families sitting on the floor. The cargo holds had been converted into makeshift passenger areas with no proper ventilation or emergency exits. People were literally stacked on top of each other, and nobody seemed to care that if something went wrong, most of these people would have no way to escape. And speaking of the crew, let me tell you about the leadership on this death trap. Captain Eusebio Nazareno was supposed to be a veteran seafarer, someone with enough experience to handle a ship full of people. But here's what nobody talks about. The entire maritime culture in the Philippines at that time was built on cutting corners and hoping for the best. Captains who raised safety concerns got replaced by captains who knew how to keep their mouths shut and maximize passenger loads. The ship was carrying way more than just people, too. The cargo holds were stuffed with Christmas goods, presents, food supplies, and who knows what else. The weight distribution was completely out of whack, which meant the ship was riding lower in the water than it should have been and was probably unstable as hell. But here's the detail that's going to stick with you. As the Doña Paz was making its way through the Tabla Strait that night, heading toward Manila with all those families dreaming of Christmas reunions, the sea was actually pretty calm. Clear skies, decent visibility, normal weather conditions. This wasn't a storm-tossed voyage where nature overwhelmed human preparations. This was a perfect night for safe travel, which makes what happened next even more inexcusable. The passengers had settled in for what should have been a routine 8-hour journey. Kids were probably getting excited about seeing their grandparents. Parents were maybe thinking about the Christmas meals they'd share, the presents they'd give, the stories they'd tell. Some people were sleeping peacefully, trusting that the crew knew what they were doing and that all those safety regulations existed for a reason. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that their lives were in the hands of people who had already decided that profits mattered more than safety. And in a few hours, that decision was going to turn a Christmas voyage into a nightmare that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Because while all those families were settling in for the night, another ship was heading straight toward them through the same waters. And that ship, the MV Vector, was carrying something that would turn the ocean itself into a weapon. What happened next turned a routine 8-hour ferry ride into the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in human history. And it all started with one moment of pure negligence that shows just how thin the line is between getting home safely and never being seen again. At 10:30 p.m. on December 20th, 1987, while most of the 4,000 passengers on the Doña Paz were sleeping or quietly chatting with their families, the ferry slammed headfirst into an oil tanker called the MV Vector. But this wasn't just any collision between two ships. This was a collision with a floating bomb carrying 8,800 barrels of gasoline and petroleum products. Let me explain exactly what that means, because the numbers don't really capture the horror of what happened next. When you're talking about 8,800 barrels of highly flammable fuel, you're talking about more than 370,000 gallons of the most dangerous cargo you can imagine on the open ocean. That's enough gasoline to fuel about 15,000 cars for an entire year, all packed into one small tanker that was about to rupture like a balloon. The impact happened so fast that most people didn't even understand what was going on at first. 1 second, passengers were sleeping peacefully or having quiet conversations. The next second, there was this tremendous crash that threw people out of their bunks and sent cargo flying across the decks. But within seconds, and I mean literally seconds, something much worse started happening. The collision ruptured the Vector's hull like it was made of paper, and thousands upon thousands of gallons of fuel began pouring into the water around both ships. Now, here's what most people don't understand about fuel spills at sea. Gasoline doesn't just sit on the surface of the water like oil does. It spreads incredibly fast, creating this thin layer of highly volatile vapor that's just waiting for the smallest spark to ignite. And guess what provides plenty of sparks? Two ships grinding against each other, metal scraping against metal, electrical systems shorting out, engines still running. The ignition was practically inevitable. Within minutes of the collision, the entire sea around both ships was literally on fire. Not just flames floating on the surface. The water itself had become a burning death trap that extended in every direction as far as people could see. Survivors described it as looking like the ocean had been turned into the mouth of hell, with flames reaching up toward the sky and black smoke billowing everywhere. But here's the part that's going to make you absolutely furious when you understand the full scope of negligence involved. The Doña Paz's bridge, the command center where trained officers are supposed to be monitoring for exactly this kind of danger, was being run by a single apprentice third mate, one guy, a trainee who probably had no business being solely responsible for navigating a ship through busy shipping lanes at night. Where were the actual officers? Where was the captain? Where were the experienced crew members who were supposed to be watching out for other ships? They were downstairs, drinking beer, playing cards, watching television, having a grand old time, while 4,000 people's lives hung in the balance. The MV Vector's crew was equally unprepared and equally negligent. This tanker was carrying enough explosive fuel to level a city block, and they were operating without a proper lookout, without a qualified master on duty, and apparently without any real understanding of the shipping traffic around them. The Vector wasn't even properly licensed for the route it was taking, so you had two ships full of people, one of them carrying enough fuel to create an inferno, and nobody on either vessel was actually paying attention to where they were going. It's like having two loaded school buses racing toward each other with drunk drivers behind the wheels. But the negligence goes even deeper than that. When investigators looked into the Vector later, they discovered that the ship was basically unseaworthy. It didn't have proper safety equipment, the crew wasn't properly trained, and the entire operation was being run like some kind of maritime amateur hour. This wasn't a professional shipping operation. This was a floating disaster waiting to happen. The moment the fuel ignited, both ships became death traps. The Doña Paz, packed with families and children, was suddenly surrounded by a wall of flames that made escape nearly impossible. People who tried to jump into the water to escape the fire found themselves jumping into more fire. The life rafts, most of them were destroyed in the explosion or caught fire immediately. And here's a detail that's going to haunt you. The life vests that might have saved thousands of lives were locked in storage cabinets throughout the ship, locked during an emergency. And the keys? The keys were lost in the chaos, or the crew members who had them were already dead or had abandoned ship. Passengers described waking up to the smell of burning fuel and the sound of metal screaming as flames climbed up the sides of their ferry like some kind of living thing. The ship's electrical systems failed almost immediately, plunging everything into darkness except for the orange glow of the fire surrounding them. People were stumbling around in the dark, trying to find their family members, trying to find a way out, while the deck plates under their feet were getting hotter and hotter. The Doña Paz started listing almost immediately, tilting to one side as water poured in through the damaged hull, and the weight distribution shifted. This meant that even the parts of the ship that weren't on fire were becoming impossible to navigate. Passengers were sliding down tilted hallways, getting trapped in compartments as doors jammed shut, and finding that the exits they thought they knew were now underwater or blocked by debris. Meanwhile, the Vector was breaking apart like a torn soda can, spilling even more fuel into the water and creating even bigger fires. The two ships were locked together in this deadly embrace, grinding against each other and spreading the flames in every direction. But here's what makes this tragedy even more heartbreaking. The collision happened in one of the busiest shipping lanes in the Philippines. There should have been other ships around. There should have been Coast Guard vessels, fishing boats, cargo ships, something. But because it was late at night and because both ships sank so fast, most of the potential rescue vessels had no idea what was happening until it was way too late. The Doña Paz took about 2 hours to sink completely. 2 hours of people trapped on a burning, tilting ship, surrounded by flaming water, with no working communications equipment to call for help and no proper safety equipment to save themselves. The Vector lasted about 4 hours before it finally went under, but by then, most of the damage was already done. And through it all, the fuel kept burning on the surface of the water, creating this massive barrier that made rescue attempts almost impossible, even when help finally started to arrive. Ships that tried to get close to look for survivors had to back off because the heat was so intense it was melting their equipment. This wasn't just a collision. This was a perfect storm of negligence, greed, and criminal disregard for human life that turned the ocean into a killing field. And the worst part? Every single factor that made this disaster so deadly was completely preventable. Imagine jumping into water to escape a fire, only to realize the water itself is burning. That's the impossible choice 4,000 people faced in the middle of the night, miles from shore. And what happened next shows you exactly what the human spirit is capable of when everything else fails. Out of over 4,000 people on that ferry, only 26 survived. 26. Let that number sink in for a moment. We're talking about a survival rate of less than 1%. Your chances of surviving the Doña Paz disaster were worse than your chances of surviving a direct hit from a nuclear bomb. But the stories of those 26 people reveal something incredible about human instinct, split-second decision-making, and the tiny moments that separate life from death. Let me tell you about Luzgardo Nido, a Philippine constabulary corporal who was traveling home for Christmas leave. He was sleeping in his bunk when the collision happened, and like most passengers, his first instinct was probably to figure out what was going on and follow whatever instructions the crew might give. But here's the thing that saved his life. He suddenly got what he later described as a hunch to jump into the sea before anyone else realized how serious the situation was. Think about that for a second. While most people were still trying to process what had happened, while they were looking for crew members to tell them what to do, while they were gathering their belongings or searching for family members, Nito made a decision that defied every normal human instinct. He jumped into dark water in the middle of the night, not knowing what was in that water or whether help would ever come. That hunch saved his life, because within minutes of his jump, the area where he had been sleeping was completely engulfed in flames. The people who took time to think it through, who tried to follow proper procedures, who waited for instructions that never came, most of them died. But Nito's survival was just the beginning of his nightmare. He spent hours in that burning water, watching the ship sink, listening to the screams of people who were trapped on board, or who had jumped too late and were now burning alive in the oil-covered sea. He had to swim through patches of floating fire, dodge pieces of burning debris, and somehow stay afloat while his clothes and skin were getting scorched by the heat. Then there's the story of Valeriana Duma, who was just 14 years old when the disaster happened. She was traveling with her family, parents, siblings, relatives, all of them excited about spending Christmas together. When the collision happened, the family was separated in the chaos, and Valeriana found herself alone on a sinking, burning ship surrounded by strangers who were just as terrified as she was. She managed to grab on to a piece of debris, probably part of the ship's superstructure that had broken off, and spent 2 days clinging to that makeshift raft while floating in the open ocean. 2 days. Picture a 14-year-old girl, injured, exhausted, probably dehydrated, watching the water around her for any sign of rescue, while trying not to think about what had happened to her family. When she was finally picked up by a rescue vessel, she was barely conscious and had no identification. She couldn't remember her last name or where she was from. The trauma of the disaster had essentially erased her identity. She spent years in hospitals and orphanages, with no way to contact whatever relatives might have survived. No way to even know if she still had a family to go back to. Here's the part that's going to break your heart. Valeriana didn't reunite with her surviving relatives until 2012, 25 years after the disaster. 25 years of not knowing who she was or where she belonged. A television program called Wishko Long was doing a story about Doña Paz survivors, and one of her relatives happened to see the show and recognized her. 25 years of lost family time because of one night of negligence. But the most heartbreaking survivor story of all involves a 4-year-old boy, whose name we still don't know for certain. 2 days after the sinking, rescue vessels found this little boy floating alone on a piece of lumber, somehow still alive after spending 2 days and nights in the open ocean. 4 years old. Imagine trying to explain to a 4-year-old why he was suddenly alone in the water, why his parents weren't there, why everything he knew had disappeared. The boy was severely injured and traumatized, and like Valeriana, he couldn't provide much information about who he was or where his family might be. The fact that he survived at all is basically a medical miracle. 4-year-olds aren't exactly known for their survival skills or their ability to hang on to floating debris for days at a time. But here's what all these survival stories have in common. They involved people who made split-second decisions that went against normal human behavior. Normal human behavior says you don't jump into dark water unless you absolutely have to. Normal human behavior says you try to find your family before you try to save yourself. Normal human behavior says you wait for instructions from people in authority. Every single one of the 26 survivors did something that ignored normal human behavior. They jumped when other people hesitated. They grabbed onto debris when other people were still looking for proper life rafts. They started swimming away from the ship when other people were still hoping the crew would get things under control. And here's what's really disturbing about the whole thing. While passengers were making these life or death decisions, many of the crew members were abandoning ship without even trying to help. Survivors reported seeing crew members jumping into lifeboats that could have held dozens of passengers, but they didn't wait to load those boats with the people they were supposed to be protecting. The life vests that might have saved thousands of lives. They were locked in storage cabinets throughout the ship, and the crew members who had the keys either couldn't be found or had already fled. Some passengers actually broke into the storage areas and found stacks of life vests, but by then, most of the ship was either underwater or on fire, and it was too late to distribute them. Meanwhile, passengers were sharing pieces of floating debris with complete strangers. People were forming human chains to help each other reach makeshift rafts. Families were making the agonizing decision to separate so that at least some members might survive. These were split-second moral choices that most of us never have to face, made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. But survival was just the beginning of the trauma for these 26 people. They spent hours floating in the dark ocean, not knowing if rescue would ever come, listening to the sounds of people drowning around them. They watched the ship sink completely, taking thousands of other passengers with them. They survived, but they also had to live with the knowledge that they had witnessed one of the most horrific maritime disasters in human history. The psychological impact on the survivors has lasted for decades. Most of them have never fully recovered from what they experienced that night. They suffer from survivor's guilt, wondering why they lived when so many others died. They have nightmares about burning water and sinking ships. They can't take ferry rides or even go near the ocean without reliving the trauma. And here's the cruelest irony of all. Many of the survivors were never properly compensated for their losses or their suffering. The legal battles went on for years. The shipping company tried to minimize their liability, and most of the families of the victims never got any kind of meaningful justice or closure. These 26 people didn't just survive a maritime disaster. They survived a complete system failure that showed how quickly civilization can break down when the people in charge stop caring about the people they're supposed to protect. And their stories raise a question that should keep you awake at night. How many other disasters are waiting to happen because someone somewhere has decided that safety regulations are just suggestions? For 32 years, the Doña Paz was just a ghost story. Families had no closure, no place to mourn, no answers about what exactly happened to their loved ones. Until 2019, when technology finally caught up to tragedy and revealed something that changed everything we thought we knew about the disaster. In April 2019, a research vessel called the MV Petrel was scanning the ocean floor near the Philippines when their sonar picked up something massive sitting in the darkness 1,600 feet below the surface. Something that had been waiting in perfect silence for over 3 decades. Something that was about to give 4,000 families the closure they never thought they'd get. The MV Petrel wasn't just any research vessel. This was a state-of-the-art ship funded by Paul Allen, the late Microsoft co-founder, specifically designed for deep-sea exploration and wreck hunting. The ship was equipped with some of the most advanced underwater scanning technology on the planet, the kind of equipment that can create detailed 3D maps of objects sitting on the seafloor in complete darkness. The crew was initially working on a project to locate and document World War II shipwrecks in Philippine waters, which is important work for historical preservation and family closure. But when local officials heard about the project, they made a request that changed everything. They asked the Petrel team to look for the Doña Paz. Think about what that request meant. For 32 years, the families of the 4,000 victims had no place to go to mourn their loved ones. No grave to visit, no memorial to touch, no physical location where they could feel connected to the people they'd lost. The ocean had swallowed their families whole, and all they had left were memories and unanswered questions. When the Petrel's sonar finally locked onto the wreck, the first images that came back were absolutely haunting. The ship was sitting upright on the seafloor, completely intact, looking almost like it could start sailing again if someone just turned the engine back on. After more than 3 decades underwater, the Doña Paz had been preserved in the cold, dark depths, like some kind of underwater time capsule. The footage they captured using remotely operated vehicles is something that will stick with you forever. You can see the railings where people once stood, probably looking out at the ocean and thinking about their families waiting for them at home. You can see the decks where children played and parents chatted during what should have been a routine ferry ride. You can see the bridge where the officers should have been paying attention but weren't. But it's not just the preservation of the ship that's remarkable, it's the preservation of the story. Every detail of that final night is still there, frozen in time. The angle of the ship shows exactly how it settled on the bottom. The damage to the hull tells the story of the collision. The location of debris around the wreck gives you a sense of how the disaster unfolded 2,200 meters away from the Doña Paz. The Petrel team found the MT Vector, also sitting in its own silent grave. The tanker that started this whole nightmare with its cargo of gasoline and petroleum products was there too. A rusty reminder of the negligence that killed over 4,000 people. But here's what makes this discovery so emotionally powerful. The families finally had a place to direct their grief. For the first time in over 3 decades, they knew exactly where their loved ones had ended up. They could point to a spot on a map and say, "That's where my father is. That's where my children are. That's where my family went down." The National Museum of the Philippines worked with the Petrel team to release the footage on the 32nd anniversary of the disaster in December 2019. Watching that footage, is like looking at an underwater cathedral, a place where thousands of people took their final breaths and where their stories ended in fire and water. But the discovery also raised new questions that are still haunting the Philippines today. If this ship could be preserved so perfectly for over 3 decades, what about all the other maritime disasters that have happened in Philippine waters? How many other families are out there with no closure, no answers, no place to mourn their dead? The Philippines has one of the worst maritime safety records in the world, and the Doña Paz wasn't even the only major disaster involving Sulpicio lines. Between 1987 and 1998, ships operated by the same company were involved in 4 major accidents that killed more than 5,000 people total. 5,000 people. That's like wiping out an entire small town multiple times because a shipping company couldn't be bothered to follow basic safety procedures. And here's what's really going to disturb you. After the Doña Paz disaster, Sulpicio lines continued operating for almost 30 more years. They changed their name a few times, shuffled some executives around, paid some fines, but they kept putting ships full of people on the water. It wasn't until 2015 that their passenger service was finally suspended, and even then they're still operating cargo ships. The discovery of the wreck also highlighted how little had actually changed in Philippine maritime safety. Since 1987, ships are still routinely overcrowded, safety inspections are still inadequate, and the economic pressures that led to the Doña Paz disaster are still there. The ferry system that connects the Philippine Islands is still essentially unregulated compared to international standards. But maybe the most disturbing aspect of the wreck discovery is what it tells us about accountability. The footage shows a perfectly preserved crime scene from 1987, with all the evidence of negligence still clearly visible. You can see exactly what went wrong, exactly how it could have been prevented, exactly who was responsible. But most of the people who made the decisions that led to this disaster were never held properly accountable. The court cases dragged on for years. The shipping company used every legal trick in the book to minimize their liability, and most of the families never received meaningful compensation for their losses. The officers who were drinking beer instead of manning their posts, most of them died in the disaster, so they never faced justice. The executives who decided to overload the ship, they moved on to other jobs and other companies. Meanwhile, the ocean kept the evidence safe for over 3 decades, waiting for someone with the right technology and the right motivation to come looking. The Doña Paz sitting on the seafloor is like a witness that can't speak, holding all the secrets of that terrible night and all the proof of the negligence that caused it. And here's the question that should keep you awake at night. How many other disasters like this are still waiting to happen? How many other ships are cutting corners on safety right now, loading too many passengers, ignoring maintenance requirements, putting profit ahead of human life? How many other families are about to lose everything because someone somewhere has decided that regulations are just suggestions? The discovery of the Doña Paz gave 4,000 families a place to mourn, but it also gave all of us a warning. The ocean remembers everything, even when we try to forget. And the stories it preserves in the cold, dark depths are stories we ignore at our own peril. As I look at the footage of the Doña Paz sitting in eternal darkness on the seafloor, perfectly preserved after more than 3 decades, I can't help but think about what the ocean is trying to tell us. This isn't just a shipwreck. This is a monument to human negligence, an underwater cemetery that holds the dreams of 4,000 people who just wanted to get home for Christmas. The sea has become the keeper of their stories, the guardian of their memory, and the witness to a disaster that should never have happened. Every piece of debris around that wreck, every twisted section of railing, every damaged compartment tells the story of split-second decisions and decades of corruption that turned a routine ferry ride into the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in human history. But here's what haunts me the most about this whole story. The Doña Paz isn't just history. It's a preview of disasters that are still waiting to happen, because the same economic pressures, the same regulatory failures, the same human greed that killed 4,000 people in 1987 are still out there, still operating, still putting profit ahead of human life. Ships around the world are still being overloaded. Safety inspections are still being faked or ignored. Crew members are still cutting corners because their bosses care more about schedules and profit margins than about the people whose lives depend on them doing their jobs correctly. And somewhere out there, right now, there's probably another ferry packed with families, another crew that's not paying attention, another company that's decided safety regulations are just suggestions. The only question is whether we'll learn from the Doña Paz before it's too late, or whether we'll just add another wreck to the ocean's collection of preventable tragedies. The 26 survivors of the Doña Paz didn't just survive a maritime disaster. They survived a complete failure of the systems that are supposed to protect us. And their stories should serve as a warning to all of us about what happens when we let greed and negligence override basic human decency. The ocean remembers everything, even when we try to forget. And the stories it preserves in its depths are stories we need to remember, honor, and learn from before history repeats itself in ways we can't undo. What other maritime disasters deserve this kind of attention? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below.